Hi guys, this is chapter 18. Going to go over section 1, Cold War conflicts. Main idea. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as two superpowers with vastly different political and economic systems. After World War II, differences between the United States and the Soviet Union led to a Cold War that lasted almost to the 21st century. Terms and names, we'll go through those, okay, as we read through this section, okay? Let's see. One American story. 70 miles south of Berlin, Joseph Pulaski and a patrol of American soldiers were scouting for signs of the Soviet army advancing from the east. As the soldiers neared the Elbe River, they saw lilacs in bloom. Pulaski later said the sight of the flowers filled them with joy. Across the Elbe, the Americans spotted Soviet soldiers, who signaled for them to cross over. When the Americans reached the opposite bank, their joy turned to shock. They saw to their horror that the bank was covered with dead civilians, victims of bombing raids. A personal voice, Joseph Pulaski. Here we are, tremendously exhilarated, and there's a sea of dead. The platoon leader was much moved. Joe, let's make a resolution with these Russians here and also the ones on the bank. This would be an important day in the lives of the two countries. It was a solemn moment. There were tears in the eyes of most of us. We embraced. We swore never to forget. The Soviet and U.S. soldiers believed that their encounter would serve as a symbol of peace. Unfortunately, such hopes were soon dashed after World War II. Let me see if I turn it this way. Hopefully it doesn't mess up your video. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as rivals, superpowers, each strong enough to greatly influence world events. Former ally clash. The United States and Soviet Union had very different ambitions for the future. These differences created a climate of icy tension that plunged the two countries into a bitter rivalry. Under Soviet communism, the state controlled all property and economic activity, while in the capitalistic American system, private citizens controlled almost all economic activity. In the American system, voting by the people elected a president and a Congress from competing political parties. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party established a totalitarian government with no opposing parties. The United States was furious that Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had been an ally of Hitler for a time. Stalin had supported the Allies only after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. In some ways, the Americans and Soviets became more suspicious of each other during the war. Stalin resented the Western Allies' delay in attacking the Germans in Europe. Such an attack, he thought, would draw part of the German army away from the Soviet Union. Relations worsened after Stalin learned that the United States had kept its development of the atomic bomb a secret. Okay, so for number 1, it's going to ask you in your study guide, who were the guys, the leaders who were in charge at the time. So we have President Harry S. Truman, who was the president of the United States, and then we had Joseph Stalin, and he's head of the Soviet Union. So that's your number 1. That's on page 603. And then the first term is here. The United Nations, in spite of these problems, hopes for the world peace were high at the end of the war. The most visible symbol of these hopes was the United Nations. On April 25, 1945, the representatives of 50 nations met in San Francisco, established the new peacekeeping body. After 2 months of debate, on June 26, 1945, the delegates signed the charter establishing the UN. So that's your first term. Also, you'll see that if you're looking at your study guide, you'll see that. Number 2 is asking you what was ironic about the UN. So ironically, even though the UN was intended to promote peace, it soon became an arena in which the two superpowers competed. Both the United States and the Soviet Union used the UN as a forum to spread their influence over others. And ironic just means like, oh, it was supposed to be for peace, but it actually was for them to try to influence other people to get them on their side. Okay, Truman becomes president. For the United States, the key figure in the early years of conflict with the Soviets was President Harry S. Truman. On April 12, 1945, Truman had suddenly become president when Franklin Roosevelt died. This former Missouri senator had been picked as Roosevelt's running mate in 1944. He had served as vice president for just a few months before Roosevelt's death. During his term as vice president, Truman had not been included in top policy decisions. He had not even known that the United States was developing an atomic bomb. Many Americans doubted Truman's ability to serve as president, but Truman was honest and had a willingness to make tough decisions, qualities that he would need desperately during his presidency. Okay, the Potsdam Conference. Truman's test as a diplomat came in July 1945 when the Big Three, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, met at the final wartime conference at Potsdam near Berlin. The countries that participated were the same ones that had been present at Yalta in February 1945. Stalin still represented the Soviet Union. Clement Attlee replaced Churchill as Britain's representative mid-conference because Churchill's party lost the general election, and Harry Truman took Roosevelt's place. At Yalta, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that he would allow free elections, that is, a vote by secret ballot in a multi-party system. In Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe that the Soviets occupied at the end of the war. By July 1945, however, it was clear that Stalin would not keep this promise. The Soviets prevented free election in Poland and banned democratic parties. So number 3 on your study guide question, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that he would allow free elections. Okay, tension mounts. Stalin's refusal to allow free elections in Poland convinced Truman that U.S. and Soviet aims were deeply at odds. Truman's goal in demanding free elections was to spread democracy to nations that had been under Nazi rule. He wanted to create a new world order in which all nations had the right of self-determination. Beginning at Potsdam, the Yalta Conference, the Soviets had wanted to take reparations from Germany to help repay Soviets' wartime losses. Now, at Potsdam, Truman objected to that. After hard bargaining, it was agreed that the Soviets, British, Americans, and French would take reparations mainly from their own occupation zones within Germany. Truman also felt that the United States had a large economic stake in spreading democracy and free trade across the globe. U.S. industry boomed during the war, making the United States the economic leader of the world. To continue growing, American businesses wanted access to raw materials in Eastern Europe, and they wanted to be able to sell goods to Eastern European countries. Soviets tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union had also emerged from the war as a nation of enormous economic and military strength. However, unlike the United States, the Soviet Union had suffered heavy devastation on its own soil. Soviets' deaths from the war had been estimated at 20 million, half of whom were civilians. As a result, the Soviets felt justified in their claim to Eastern Europe. By dominating this region, the Soviets felt they could stop future invasions from the West. And that has to do with the satellite nations. One of the terms or questions, I'll have to go back and look, but was about why was the satellite nations set up, or what was the satellite nations? I'm not sure. We'll have to look. We'll go back and look at the study guide. Okay, so Stalin installed communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, the Czech, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. These countries became known, sorry guys, that stop button's in my way, as the satellite nations, countries dominated by the Soviet Union. In early 1946, Stalin gave a speech announcing that communism and capitalism were incompatible, and that another war was inevitable. It was gonna happen, right? Because communism and capitalism, not the same thing. They don't get along. United States establishes a policy of containment. Faced with the Soviet threat, American officials decided it was time, in Truman's words, to stop babying the Soviets. In February 46, George F. Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow, proposed a policy of containment. By containment, he meant taking measures to prevent an extension of communist rule to other countries. So you can see I've highlighted satellite nations and containment. Those are both terms that you need to be completing on your study guide. This policy began to guide the Truman administration's foreign policy. Europe was now divided into two political regions, a mostly democratic Western Europe and a communist Eastern Europe. In March 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States and gave a speech that described the situation in Europe. Personal voice, Winston Churchill. A shadow has fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. So here's another term. The phrase Iron Curtain came to stand for the division of Europe. When Stalin heard about this speech, he declared it in no uncertain terms that Churchill's words were a call to war. Okay, so Iron Curtain, between democracy and communism. One of your questions, I think it might be number 4, asks you to look at this chart. So I'm going to zoom in on this side. So it says U.S. aims versus Soviet aims in Europe. The United States wanted to create a new world order in which all nations had the right of self-determination, gain access to raw materials and markets for its industries, rebuild European governments to ensure stability and to create new markets for American goods, reunite Germany, believing that Europe would be more secure if Germany were productive, encourage communism. This is the Soviets, what they wanted. Encourage communism in other countries as part of the worldwide struggle between workers and the wealthy. Rebuild its war-ravaged economy using Eastern Europeans' industrial equipment and raw materials. So they both want that. Control Eastern Europe to balance U.S. influence in Western Europe. Keep Germany divided and weak so that it would never again threaten the Soviet Union. Which aims involved economic growth of the United States? Which Soviet aims involved self-protection? So over here, one for the Soviets' protection, they want to keep Germany divided and weak so that it would never again threaten the Soviet Union. As far as which aims involved economic growth of the United States, if they gain access to raw materials and markets for its industry, that helps. America, rebuild European governments to ensure stability and to create new markets for American goods. Reunite Germany, believing that Europe would be more secure if Germany were productive. Most of what the United States wants are aims that are involved in some economic growth. The next section is going over another term. So we have Stalin installed communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, Czech, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. These countries became known as satellite nations. countries dominated by the Soviet Union. In early 1946, Stalin gave a speech announcing that communism and capitalism were incompatible. And I thought I already read this. I hope I did.